Is tithing really mandatory? What the Vatican doesn't want you to know. Did you know that the practice of tithing, as it is widely taught today, may not have any basis in the New Testament? What do the Vatican and other religious denominations prefer not to discuss about this charge? Get ready for a journey that will reveal hidden facts, historical manipulations, and surprising truths that may change your view on faith and generosity. Is tithing a biblical practice or an instrument of manipulation? Stay with us until the end, because the answer may surprise you. We draw on biblical texts, apocrypha and historical accounts, and we also delve into questions that few dare to ask. Where does the New Testament actually mention tithing as a mandatory rule? Why do so many modern churches insist on charging tithes in money when the original practice was based on food? Has tithing been transformed from a voluntary action into a mechanism of religious control? This video will reveal how the practice of tithing has evolved since ancient times through its application in the Mosaic Law to the transformations in early Christianity. We will analyze verses frequently used to justify mandatory tithing and how these interpretations have been manipulated over time. More than that, we will highlight real stories of people who have suffered emotional and financial pressures in their religious communities due to the collection of tithing. Are we facing a call to generosity or a system that exploits the faith of the faithful? And do you believe that tithing is mandatory or voluntary? Have you ever felt pressured to contribute in your religious community? And get ready to discover the secrets behind tithing, from its origins to the reasons why it continues to be such a controversial topic today. Combining historical facts, theological analysis, and contemporary reflections, this video will challenge you to re-evaluate your beliefs and understand the truth that many religious leaders do not want you to know. And remember, like this video, subscribe to the Gaia's Ascension channel, and share it so that more people can discover the truth about this controversial topic. After all, the truth sets you free. The origin of tithing, from a voluntary action to imposition. Did you know that tithing was not originally a financial obligation, but rather an act of generosity based on food and provisions? Before becoming an institutionalized practice, tithing had a very different purpose, deeply linked to survival and caring for the community. The practice of tithing predates Christianity and dates back to ancient civilizations, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt. In these cultures, taxes were a way of supporting religious or political leaders, offered in the form of crops or livestock. These people believed that returning a portion of their wealth to the gods or kings would guarantee blessings and prosperity. In the Jewish tradition, tithing was incorporated into the Mosaic Law as an obligation to support the Levites, who were responsible for the services in the temple. They did not own land, and therefore depended on the generosity of the people. But here's the important thing. Tithing has always been in the form of agricultural produce and livestock, never in cash. This made sense in an agrarian economy where wealth was measured in material goods. The spirit behind tithing was voluntary and communal. It was a way to ensure that no one went hungry or in need, especially the most vulnerable groups such as orphans, widows, and foreigners. The concept was less about fulfilling an obligation and more about sharing the abundance received. In biblical times, tithing was an expression of gratitude to God, not an imposition with spiritual sanctions. In Deuteronomy 14:22-29, for example, we find instructions on how tithing should be used, emphasizing celebration and inclusion. Over time, and especially with the rise of Christianity, the practice of tithing began to transform. Early Christians did not strictly follow the Mosaic Law and instead emphasized spontaneous generosity. Acts 4:32-35 describes how followers of Jesus shared their wealth voluntarily without any specific rules being imposed. It was only as the church grew and its structure grew that tithing began to be seen as a formal obligation. During the Middle Ages, the Vatican played a central role in institutionalizing tithing as a religious tax, now in cash, to support the activities and properties of the Church. This gradual shift changed the essence of tithing from a practice based on generosity to a source of financial control. Today, many wonder, why was tithing, originally voluntary and focused on the community, transformed into a mandatory system? Has its original essence been distorted to meet the financial needs of religious institutions? These questions are central to understanding the true meaning of tithing and the impact it still has on contemporary religious practices. Have you ever wondered why tithing has changed so much over time? Do you think it should return to its voluntary origins? Let us know in the comments. Manipulation or tradition, what the New Testament says. Tithing is often presented as an essential practice for believers, but does the New Testament really validate this requirement? Or is this idea a reflection of traditions reinterpreted over the centuries? Let's dive into the biblical text and uncover what it really tells us about tithing. For many religious leaders, the main justification for charging tithing comes from Malachi 3:10 in the Old Testament. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. However, it is important to note that this verse refers to the Mosaic law, which determined tithing as a provision for the Levites, widows, and orphans. But here is the question. Does this rule continue to be valid in the New Testament? In the New Testament, tithing is barely mentioned, and when it does appear, it is not treated as a mandatory rule for Christians. For example, Matthew 23:23, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for strictly tithing on herbs, while neglecting more important principles such as justice, mercy, and faith. Here, he is not reinforcing tithing as an obligation, but using the example to point out religious hypocrisy. In 2 Corinthians 9:7, Paul writes, "Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." This passage emphasizes voluntary generosity, without mentioning a fixed percentage or mandatory tithing. These examples reveal that the focus in the New Testament is not on maintaining a fixed practice, but on a spirit of free and selfless giving. Despite this, many denominations continue to pressure believers to pay tithing, often using fear as a tool of control. How many times have you heard phrases like, "If you do not tithe, you are robbing God"? These distorted interpretations transform a spiritual action into an emotional and financial imposition. In some communities, tithing is even presented as a bargaining chip. The more you give, the more financial blessings you will receive. This practice, known as prosperity theology, is widely criticized for distorting the true purpose of giving. The New Testament makes it clear that giving should be a reflection of the heart, not a legal imposition. So why do so many modern churches continue to insist on mandatory tithing? Has this practice evolved more as a financial necessity of institutions than as a spiritual principle? These questions lead us to reflect. Are we truly following the teachings of Christ, or are we falling into the trap of religious manipulation? The church and tithing, control or spiritual necessity. Have you ever wondered why so many churches insist on the obligation of tithing, even when its biblical origins are questionable? Is this practice more about maintaining power and control than about a spiritual need? Let's explore how tithing evolved from an act of communal generosity to an institutional instrument that raises serious questions about its true purpose. In the early centuries of Christianity, the practice of tithing was not a priority. followers of Jesus shared their possessions voluntarily, as described in Acts 4:32-35, where no one claimed anything that he owned as his own, but everyone shared everything. There was no formal system of tithing, and giving was motivated by faith and compassion. It was only after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine that the structure of the church began to take shape. During the Middle Ages, tithing was transformed into a mandatory religious tax used to finance church property and support the clergy. The shift from food to money reflected the rise of a more complex economy and the growing power of the church as a political and economic institution. With the rise of the Vatican as the center of Western Christianity, tithing became an indispensable tool for consolidating the power of the church. For centuries, it was used not only to support religious activities, but also to finance wars, build cathedrals, and maintain control over vast territories. This institutionalization brought clear benefits to the church, but it also raised questions. To what extent was tithing aligned with its original spiritual principles? Had it become a mechanism of economic control rather than an act of faith? Modern tithing in many denominations is often presented as a spiritual obligation. Messages such as, "If you don't tithe, God won't bless your life," are common in some religious contexts. This approach creates an environment of fear and emotional pressure, where believers feel that their connection with God is directly linked to the financial value they give. On the other hand, some churches argue that tithing is essential to maintain community activities, pay salaries, help those in need, and finance missions. But is this model, based on obligation, the only solution? Today, more and more believers are beginning to question the use of tithing. Why does it continue to be mandatory in some denominations, even when the New Testament does not reinforce it as a rule? Has it become a form of manipulation rather than a call to generosity? This reflection is essential to understanding the role of the church in modern society. Tithing should be an act of faith and gratitude, not a bargaining chip or an instrument of control. And this leads us to a fundamental question. What is the true purpose of tithing in your spiritual life? Do you think tithing has become more of a financial control than a spiritual necessity? Share your opinion. Modern impacts, pressure, manipulation, and resistance. Have you ever stopped to think about how tithing, an originally voluntary practice, has become an instrument of emotional pressure and financial manipulation in many religious communities? In today's world, where issues of transparency and ethics are constantly debated, it is impossible to ignore the impact that this practice has on the lives of millions of believers. Imagine this scenario. A believer enters church already facing financial difficulties and hears the pastor say, "If you don't tithe, you will be robbing God," or "Your blessing depends on your contribution." These phrases, commonly used in some religious contexts, create an enormous emotional burden, making many feel guilty for not contributing, even when they do not have the financial means to do so. Many churches associate tithing directly with promises of material blessings, a practice that has become popular through the so-called prosperity theology. This approach turns faith into a bargaining chip. The more you give, the more you will be blessed. But what happens when these promises are not fulfilled? Feelings of guilt and frustration often drive people away, not only from church, but also from their spirituality. Several stories show the direct impact of this pressure. Maria, a widow who could barely pay her bills, shared that she felt obliged to tithe because she believed that if she didn't, God would punish her. On the other hand, Jerome, an unemployed young man, revealed that he was constantly reminded that tithing would open doors to employment. Stories like these illustrate how manipulation can directly affect the most vulnerable people, making tithing a source of anguish rather than hope. In recent years, a growing movement of believers has begun to question the obligation to tithe. Social media and discussion platforms have allowed people to share their experiences, exposing abusive practices and encouraging greater transparency in church finances. Some religious communities have already begun to adopt more transparent and inclusive practices, abandoning the mandatory tithing in favor of spontaneous donations. Instead of creating fear, they promote a culture of genuine generosity, which rescues the true spirit of tithing as an act of love for others. Tithing should be an expression of faith and gratitude, but in many cases, it has become a tool of manipulation. How can we reverse this scenario? Is it possible to rescue the original purpose of this practice without it continuing to be a source of emotional and financial pressure? This reflection is more relevant than ever, especially in a world where spirituality should be a path of peace and not oppression. The hidden truth: why tithing continues to be enforced. Tithing, originally a practice based on generosity and community care, has over the centuries become a financial obligation imposed by many religious institutions. But why is this practice still so defended, even when faced with theological and ethical doubts? Let's explore the hidden reasons that keep tithing at the center of many churches and how this practice connects to spirituality and social control. Many churches argue that tithing is a form of obedience to God and a test of faith. Religious leaders often cite Old Testament passages such as Malachi 3:10 to reinforce the idea that tithing is a divine requirement. However, as we saw earlier, the New Testament does not support the obligation of tithing, replacing it with principles of generosity and voluntary giving. Why then do so many denominations continue to insist on tithing? The answer may lie in a combination of tradition, financial need, and in some cases, institutional interests. Maintaining a church, especially in large urban centers, requires significant financial resources. Salaries of religious leaders, building maintenance, social programs, and community events are just some of the expenses faced by religious institutions. In this context, tithing has become a stable and predictable source of income, essential for the sustainability of these organizations. But there is a fine line between transparency and abuse. In some churches, the lack of accountability for the use of money generates distrust among the faithful. Why, for example, do some leaders live in luxury while the community faces financial difficulties? This contrast creates a negative image and raises suspicions about the real reasons behind the collection of tithes. In addition to the financial aspect, tithing can also be seen as a tool of social control. The association between contribution and blessings creates a dynamic of dependence, where the faithful believe that their spiritual and material lives are directly linked to their ability to donate. In some cases, this pressure is exacerbated by discourses that associate the lack of tithing with disobedience or a lack of faith. This type of psychological manipulation not only affects the relationship between believers and their religious communities, but can also impact their emotional and financial health. With the advancement of information and the growing questioning of religious practices, more and more people are calling for transparency and accountability. Tithing, like any other spiritual practice, must be based on ethical principles and respect individual freedom. Is it time for churches to rethink the mandatory nature of tithing and return to its original purpose, a voluntary expression of faith and gratitude? What do you think? Does tithing still make sense as an obligation, or should it be something completely voluntary? Leave your opinion in the comments and share this video so that more people reflect on this topic.